Okay, all right guys, so I'm done ironing the interfacing on the skirt. Okay, so this is the front piece and this is the back piece. Remember, the two of them are still pinned together. The two back pieces are still pinned together. Now it's time for us to start our marking. Okay, now, okay, so I'm trying to look for the notch for the zip. All right, so I've seen it. Now just imagine if we did not notch this side. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is to go ahead and mark our 1-inch zip allowance out. Okay, so I don't have a colored chalk, that's why I'm using a pen. Okay, so I'll mark my 1-inch zip allowance. Okay, so this is our hip line, so I'll mark my 1-inch zip allowance to that point. Okay, and I'll continue with my chalk. Okay, so I'm basically marking the 1-inch allowance that we left here, so I'll mark it all the way to the hem. Okay, so here we have it. Now the first thing we're going to do is to go ahead and stitch. So I'm going to use a loose stitch. I'll stitch from the waist, okay, to our hip line, and I'll stop here with the loose stitch. I'll tighten my stitch back to the normal stitch, and we are going to stitch from here. Okay, now let's indicate our slit opening. Okay, remember our 2 inches hemming allowance that we left. We need to mark that out first. Okay, so our 2 inches is out of the way. Now let's determine our slit opening. Remember, on the lining we marked our slit to be 8 inches. Okay, now we're going to mark that 8 inches back here. Okay, so I'll use a loose stitch from the waist to the hip line, and I'll tighten my stitch back to the normal stitch, and we'll stitch from here to this 8 inches mark that we have here. From here we'll return back to the loose stitch and finish it to the hem. Okay, this is just for the center back. Okay, we're not doing anything on the front piece yet. Okay, now back to the lining. We're doing the same. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and remove the pins. Okay, so lining, we're doing the same. I'm marking the 1-inch allowance that we have on the center back, so I'll mark it all the way to the hem. Okay, like so. Okay, now I am also going to do the same thing. I'll use a loose stitch, okay, and stitch it from here to the hip line, but from the hip line for the lining I'll come down by 0.25. okay, so the lining and the main fabric is not going to stop at the same place. So on the lining I'm coming down by 0.25 below the hip line. So I use a loose stitch from the waist to the 0.25 below the hip line, and we'll continue from there to our stitch line, sorry, our slit. Also remember our 8 inches slit that we marked, okay, on the main fabric. Now for the lining I also like to go up by 0.25. okay, so this is it. Now this is our slit line for the lining. Okay, so I like to use my ruler to connect these measurements. Okay, like so. Okay, remember this is our slit line for the lining. Now let's go ahead and mark our darts. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is to indicate the hip line. Okay, so this is the hip line. Now we will remember on the pattern we went up by 2 inches. Okay, so we'll mark our 2 inches, then we'll bring down our darts. Okay, like so. Okay, I'll repeat the same thing on this other side as well. I'll use my ruler to connect the hip line like so. Okay, and on that hip line I'll go up by 2 inches. Okay, just like we did on the pattern. Then remember our notch for the darts, so I'll use my ruler to mark the darts again. Okay, so here we have it. Now I'll do the same thing on the back piece. Okay, so I'll repeat this process on the back piece. Okay, I'll mark the darts as well, and then we'll take this to the sewing machine and we'll sew together. So let's proceed with our sewing. Okay, so like I explained for us, we'll start. Now for my settings, I'll return it to the loose stitch. Okay, and we will start sewing. Okay, once I get to that hip line, I'll change it back to my normal tight stitch. Okay, and I will backstitch. I'll backstitch, and then I'll continue with this tight stitch downwards like so, making sure that I'm sewing on the line. Okay, make sure that you're sewing on the line. Now once I get to our slit mark, I will backstitch. Okay, then I'll return the stitch back to a loose stitch. Okay, like so. Okay, and here we have it. Now I'll do the same here. Okay, I'll do the same on the lining, then I'll show us what next to do. So I'm done stitching the lining as well. Now the next thing for us to do is to hold the dart. Okay, and to hold the dart is simple. We're simply going to fold our markings into two like so. Okay, making sure that it aligns on the waistline. Then we'll fix it in. And remember, I've returned it back to a normal tight stitch. So I'll start sewing. Okay. Now always ensure that you cut your thread. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side back. Okay, and on the main fabric as well, and I'll show us. I'm done sewing. Okay, now the next stage is for us to iron this open. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and iron the center back open, press down the darts. Okay, then we'll move over to the shaping. Okay, all right guys, you're welcome back. Okay, so I'm done pressing. Okay, so I've pressed all our stitches open, including the dart. Okay, let me turn it to the right side so you see how flat is looking. Okay, so you can see. Now I will introduce us to the method I use to shape my outfit. Okay, so that you will not need to do any form of amendments anymore. Okay, so it's going to perfectly fit. Okay, now the first thing we need to do is to write. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to write. Now we're going to be taking it front and back pieces separate. Okay, so we'll be measuring the waist of the front skirt. Okay, so I'll write it WF. Okay, so this is the waist of the front skirt. Okay, we'll also be measuring the hip of the front skirt, so I'll call it HF. Okay, we'll also be measuring the knee line of the front skirt. Okay, so this is it, the waistline of the front skirt, hip line of the front skirt, and the knee line of the front skirt. Now we'll repeat the same thing for the back skirt as well. Okay, so the waistline of the back, we'll call it WB, the hip line for the back, and the knee line for the back skirt. Okay, now that we have this out of the way, I'll come in with our measuring tape. Okay, and we will start our measurements. Okay, so let's start with the waistline of the front. Okay, so this is the front piece. Now to measure the waistline, you come in with your tape and you measure it. Okay, now you need to stretch out Okay, so what we have here is 22.75. All right, so I'll go ahead and write it 22.75. Okay, now we'll also measure the hip line of the front skirt as well. You remember our notches? Okay, so I'll place it on the notches. Okay, now the hip line is 25 inches for the front skirt. I'll go ahead and write it 25. Okay, then we need to measure the knee line of the front skirt. So I'll place my tape on the notches, and the knee line is 22.5. Okay, so I'll write it 22.5, and this is it for the front skirt. We'll come in with the back skirt. So this is the inside of the back skirt. Okay, now let's measure. So we'll start with the waistline as well. I'll place my tape on the waist. Now you need to stretch out the waist, and remember we have not fixed our zip. Okay, so we'll place your tape on the waistline. Okay, and you stretch out your waistline like I'm doing. So the waistline for the back is 21.5. Okay, now let's measure the hip line for the back. You also come in with your tape, place it on one notch. Okay, stretch out your the fabric, okay, like so, and the hip line for the back is 25 inches. Okay, now let's measure the knee line for the back. So the knee line for the back is 22.5 inches as well. Okay, now it's time for us to do a little bit of calculation. Okay, so it's time for us to do a little bit of calculation. Now, the first thing we're going to do is to write my actual measurements. Okay, now my actual measurements. Okay, now remember the waist we're working with is 36. Okay, the hip round that we're working with is 44. Okay, now the knee line that we're working with, let me show us how to get your knee line. So a quick reminder, remember that when we were drafting our skirt pattern for the knee line, we got our knee line by subtracting 1.5 inches from the hip round. Okay, and our hip round, we got it by dividing my hip round of 44 by 4. Okay, and we got 11 inches. Now we subtracted 1.5 from this 11 inches and we got 9.5. So this was what we marked on our skirt pattern. Okay, and to know what your knee round is, you're simply going to do that 9.5 that we used multiplied by 4. Okay, so it means our knee round measurement is 38. This was actually what we used. Okay, we did our hip round divided by 4, we got 11, and we subtracted 1.5 inches, so that gave us 9.5. If you multiply 9.5 by 4, okay, you will get 38. Okay, remember that all our measurements were divided by 4. All right, so now that we have this, our actual measurements that we used out of the way, let's go ahead and add. So for the waistline now, okay, so for the waistline, we're going to add our waistline for the front. Okay, what we got, our measurements on the waistline front and our measurements on the waistline back. We'll add them together. So 22.75 plus 21.5. So we have 44.25. Now we'll go ahead and subtract my actual waist measurement from it. Okay, so 44.25 minus 36. What we have now is 8.25. Now 8.25, all our measurements were dividing by 4. Okay, so 8.25 divided by 4. So what we have as our waist is 2. Okay, is 2.06. So we'll approximate that to 2 inches. Okay, now let's move over to the hip. So we'll add our hip front and hip back as well. 25 plus 25, that will give us 50 inches. Okay, so that will give us 50. Now 50 minus 44. Okay, but let me introduce us to something. Now whenever you want to work on your hip, okay, especially if the outfit is going to be lined. Remember that we're going to line this skirt. Now, I don't use my actual hip measurement. I go ahead and add 1 inch to this, okay? I'll show us the reason why I add 1 inch to this. So for my hip round, instead of using 44, I'll go ahead and use 45, okay? So we added 1 inch to the hip round, okay? So we will go back again. Our hip front is 25, so we're adding hip front plus hip back, which is 25 plus 25, and that will give us 50. So we'll go ahead and subtract for this 45, okay, from that 50, and what we have is 5 inches. So we're dividing that 5 inches by 4, and we have 1.25. So our hip is 1.25. Now let's move over to the knee. All right, let's continue. Now for the knee line, okay, for my knee as well, I also add 1 inch allowance to this, okay? So instead of using 38, I use 39. So if you take note, I don't add anything on my waist round, okay? I add 1 inch to my hip round, and I add 1 inch to my knee round, okay? Okay, so let's add our measurements. So our knee front 22.5 plus our knee back 22.5. So we have 45, okay? We'll go ahead and subtract 39, okay? And we have 6 inches. Now we're dividing it by 4, and we have 1.5, okay, as my knee measurement. Now that we have this out of the way, let's come in with our fabrics and shape, okay? Okay, so let's start with our shaping. So our waist that we're working with is 2 inches, okay? So on the waistline, I will mark my 2 inches, okay? Now, remember our notch. So this is the importance of the notch. So on the hip, remember our hip measurement is 1.25, okay? So I'll go ahead and mark my 1.25, okay, on the hip measurement, okay? So this is 1, this is 1.25, okay? So this is 1.25. That's what I just marked here, all right? Now on the knee, our knee measurement is 1.5, okay? So I'll go ahead and mark my 1.5 on the knee, okay? And you're also marking it at your hem as well. So on the hem, I'll mark my 1.5 inches, okay? Then I'll come in with my ruler. I'll come in with my ruler to connect the lines. So we're connecting from the hip measurement to the waist, like so. Okay, remember to make use of your colored chalk. Okay, then we're connecting from the knee to we're connecting from the hip to the knee, like so. Okay. Okay, then we're also connecting from the knee to the hem of the skirt. All right, like so. Okay, and here we have it. So I will go ahead and repeat the same thing. Now, if you take note, I'm marking only on the right, okay? I'm not marking both sides. I'm marking only on the right, okay? Now, on the hip side, you will need to blend this area, okay? You don't want this hip line, especially the hip point, sharp, okay? So you just go ahead and blend it a little. Now, that's it for the back fabric. I'll come in with the front piece as well. So we're repeating the same thing on the front piece. So on the waistline of the front, I will mark our 2 inches on the waistline. On the hip line as well, I'll mark our 1.25, okay? So this is our 1.25 on the hip line, okay? On the knee line, I will mark our 1.5, okay? So this is my 1.5 on the knee line. We're also marking the same 1.5 on the hem of the skirt, okay? So we'll go ahead now and connect these measurements, okay? You will first connect from your waist to your hip, Okay, waist to hip first, then hip to knee, like so. Okay, then from the knee to the hem of the skirt. Okay, here we have it. Now let me show us the reason why we added 1 inch. If you take a look at this hip line, you can see the sharp curve there, and our body is not shaped this way. Okay, so you will come in with your ruler, or you can use your free hand, and you will blend this side, okay, like so. Okay, now if you measure this distance, you will find out that we have taken 0.25 out. If you measure this point, you find out that we have taken 0.25 out, and if you multiply 0.25 by 4, that will give you that 1 inch that we added. So this is us taking it out. Okay, so that's the reason why. All right, so here we have it. Now let's move over to the lining. So this is the lining piece. Now when it comes to the lining, you're not supposed to mark the exact measurement that you marked on your main fashion fabric. That's the reason why the outfit will come out tight, okay, even when it's not actually tight. Now for the lining, we are marking the same waist measurement of 2 inches. But on the hip line, instead of marking 1.25, on the hip line, we're going to mark 1 inch, okay? You're advised to take off 0.5, okay? So on the hip line, we're going to mark 1 inch or even 0.75, okay? So that's what we're marking on the hip line. The hip line, we're marking, okay, so on the hip line, we're marking 0.75. So we're subtracting 0.5 from this actual hip line measurement. And on the knee line, we are marking 1 inch. Okay, I needed to tell us that these are the things that will make your outfit not to be tight. Okay, remember what I said? So on the waistline, we are marking our actual waist measurement of 2 inches. Okay, but on the hip line, we are marking 0.75. Okay, this is what we are marking on the hip line. All right, so on the knee line, instead of 1.5 inches, on the knee line, we're going to mark 1 inch. Okay, 1 inch or 1.25. Okay, and on the hem of the skirt, okay, because we are turning it with the lining, so they must match here. So on the hem, we are marking 1.5 inches. Okay, so let's go ahead and connect these measurements. Now we're connecting from the waist to the hip, from the hip to the knee, okay, like so, and from the knee to the hem of the skirt, okay, like so. So I'll repeat the same thing on the other. I'll repeat the same thing on the front of this of the skirt, okay. So we're doing the same thing here as well, okay. I just want us to get it, okay. So on the waistline, for the lining, we're marking 2 inches. Hip line, we marked 0.75, okay, and on the knee line, we marked 1 inch, okay. Okay, so on the hem of the skirt, we're marking our 1.5 inches, okay, and the mark is already there. Now let's go ahead and connect these measurements. Okay, now anywhere you have sharp curve, you blend, okay. And here we have it. Now this skirt is going to be a bandless skirt, okay, but if you want a band, your band is supposed to be between 1 inch to 1.5, okay, or 2 inches. Now it all depends on the kind of band you want, okay. So but make sure you cut your band fabric on bias. All right, so we'll go ahead now and join. Okay, so we're going to be joining lining to lining and fabric to fabric. So we'll start with the lining piece. So the lining piece, the first rule of thumb when joining is to pin. Okay, now in pinning, you ensure that all our notches match. Okay, so I'm aligning our hip line. Okay, then you align your waistline as well, okay, with a pin. You align your knee line also. Remember, we have the fabric right side to right side facing each other. The wrong side is what is facing me. Okay, so you align your knee length and the hem of the skirt. Now, one secret is that one thing you must ensure is that it meets. Okay, now when we are sewing, I'll show us the reason why most times when you're sewing it does not meet and you are forced to trim. Okay, so you ensure that it lines. When we're done with this side, we'll also pin this side as well. Okay, and sew. All right, so let me bring the main fashion fabric and we will repeat the same thing. So I'll place it right sides facing each other. This is the right side of the fabric and this is the right side. This is the right side of the lining facing each other like so. Okay, and we'll come in with our pins as well and begin to align our notches. Okay, so we're aligning the knee line. It must meet. Okay, the waistline as well. Okay, they must meet. And we're also aligning the knee. Okay, ensure that your notches meet. Okay, and then the hem of the skirt also must meet. All right, now let's move over to the sewing machine and we'll begin joining. Okay, so but before we go ahead and join, I will show us how to fix a zip. Okay, so in my next video I'll be showing us how to fix a zip in details. All right guys, bye.